welcome to episode 2 of my Learn to Sew series. I'm Candace and I'm a sewing pattern designer and content creator, and I created this series to help you learn how to sew. So in today's episode, I'm going to show you how to use a sewing machine. If you're completely new to sewing and have never even touched a sewing machine, don't worry. This video is going to show you everything you need to know step by step to get started. In this video, I'll give you a little sewing machine tour. I'll teach you how to thread your machine, what stitch length and width to use, and what tension to use, and how to spot tension problems. Before we thread it, I'm going to give you a super quick little tour of all the parts and what they do on the machine. So this is my machine. I have the Viking Jade 20. Don't worry if you don't have this exact model. Most modern sewing machines are very similar in the way that they're made, and they have pretty much all the same parts. Your machine will come with a foot pedal, and this makes your sewing machine go. Mine plugs in with a little jack like this, and it also comes with a power cord that looks like this. There's a hand wheel on the side which you can crank to make the needle go up and down. And these little spiky things here are called the feed dogs, and they feed your fabric through the machine. This little lever here raises and lowers your presser foot. And this machine is computerized, so the stitch length and width is controlled by these little buttons here. If you have a mechanical machine, yours might be on dials. Here is the bobbin case, and this is where the bobbin lives. Most modern machines have a top loading bobbin, but if you have a vintage machine, it might load from the bottom. Here is the spool for the top thread. There might be 2 on your sewing machine, and this little metal post is the bobbin loader. This is the tension dial, and this little arrow button is the reverse button. There are some buttons on the front for the most commonly used stitches on this machine. This one comes with more than 80 stitch options, and they're all listed on the lid of the machine. And lastly, you can remove this bottom piece of the machine, and it has these little storage compartments where you can store bobbins or extra needles. And removing this also allows you to access the free arm to sew small things like sleeves or baby clothes. So if you've bought a new sewing machine, it probably came with a multi-pack of needles. And for most projects, you're going to want to use an 80 or 90 needle, and that refers to the size of the needle. And you'll want to use a universal because it's good for most projects. You can use it on most woven fabrics. Now, the size of the needle changes depending on what kind of fabric you're using. 80 and 90 are a good size and starting point for most fabrics. And the next thing that you're going to need is thread, of course. So for thread, I like to use a polyester sew-all thread. Thread comes in lots of different weights and colors, and there are lots of different brands out there, but I would recommend buying a good brand because the cheap brands can make your machine jam up, and they're really fuzzy, and they're just not that pleasant to sew with. So I always recommend people buy either Mettler or Gutermann thread, as they're very good quality, and my machines run really well with them. I usually buy these big spools. This one's almost empty. This one has 1,000 yards in it. Or you can also get these small ones, but 100% polyester sew-all thread is going to be what you want to work with because it's really durable, it lasts a long time, and it's suitable for pretty much any project you're going to make. So let's get to threading this machine. You'll need your bobbin and a spool of thread. This is the bobbin, and it holds your lower thread in the machine. And we're going to load this up first. So you'll start by placing your thread spool on the top spool pin. Then we'll place the spool cap on top, and we're going to follow the thread path that is outlined on the machine. If you have a newer machine, there's probably arrows to show you where it goes. This machine admittedly has a bit of a complicated thread path, but on your machine, it's probably going to go to the left and then back over to the right to a little tension disc that looks like this, and you're going to want to make sure your thread is properly seated in the tension disc. It'll make a little clicking noise. Then you'll take your thread and thread it through that tiny hole in the bobbin, pulling out a few inches of slack, and then place it on the bobbin spool and click it to the right. Your machine might have a little lever to click over, but just check your manual if you're unsure. To load your bobbin, just step on the pedal and it will start winding. Once it's secure, you can cut off the little tail and then just keep pressing the pedal until your bobbin is full and the turning stops. It should automatically stop when it's full. Once it's all loaded up, you can bring it over to the bobbin case and just make sure the thread is coming off the bobbin to the left, so counterclockwise. A tip to remember which way it goes is it should look like the letter P. Then you'll just drop your bobbin into the bobbin case and follow the thread guide. Just like when you wound the bobbin, you want to make sure the thread is properly seated, so I find it helpful to hold the bobbin down with one finger as I pull the thread through the guides. Make sure to put that little lid back on, and we're ready for the top thread. So the top thread's already on, but we're going to want to take the thread out of the guides that we use to wind the bobbin. And there should be a different set of arrows for threading the top thread of the machine. As I mentioned earlier, most machines are going to have a very similar thread path to this one. It will go over to the left from the spool, over to an upper thread guide, which might be a hook or just a pathway like this. Then it will travel down and in front of the tension plate. Then it'll take a U-turn to go back up and into the take-up lever, and then back down to the needle where there should be another hook just above the needle, and then you can thread the eye of the needle. Most newer sewing machines have an automatic threader like this one, and it makes it super easy to thread the needle. If you've never used one, here is how you do it. You pull the thread over so it catches on that hook, and then you bring it back to the right, and you'll bring the thread into that little slot, holding it tight. And there's going to be a little hook that catches your thread, and then you'll let go with your left hand, and that little hook will pull the thread from the front to the back of the needle through. Then you can pull the remaining thread through, and you're done. If you need to change the needle or yours didn't come with one, you can loosen this little screw that's just above the needle with a little screwdriver. Machine needles have a flat side and a rounded side, and in most machines you're going to be placing it with the flat side facing towards the back of the machine. So you just put it back in place, hand tighten that little screw, and then give it another little tighten with a screwdriver to make sure it's secure. Next, we're going to bring the bobbin thread up to the top. So you're going to take a hold of the top thread, turn the hand wheel towards you so that the needle goes down and back up, and you'll see that the top thread pulls up the bobbin thread slightly. So when it pulls up that little loop, use a screwdriver or something flat to push the thread to the side so that you have both tails above the needle plate. And just to show you another example on a different machine, this one is very similar. It comes off the spool to the left through the top thread guide, goes down in front of the tension plate, does a U-turn, goes back up into the take-up lever, and then down to the needle where you will put it through the hook above the needle, and then just thread the eye. So most machines are going to be thread this way or very, very similarly to this one. Now that our machine is threaded, we can start sewing a seam. So the first thing to know is we're usually sewing fabrics right sides together, and that's because you don't want to be able to see this seam allowance on the outside of your clothing or your project, so that when it's right sides out, the seam will be like this and you won't be able to see the stitches. Some fabrics don't have an obvious right side and wrong side, so for those I like to label them with an R and a W, or you can also use a piece of tape and put it on whichever side you want to indicate is the right side or wrong side. Other fabrics like this printed one, there is an obvious right side and a wrong side, so you won't need to label ones like this. Basically, all sewing patterns will give you a seam allowance, which is the distance from the raw edge of the fabric to the seam. So if you have a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch, this measurement from here to here is going to be 5/8 of an inch. The most common seam allowance amounts in sewing garments are 3/8 of an inch and 5/8 of an inch. And you can see just what that looks like on fabric. So the smaller the seam allowance, the narrower this section between the seam and the raw edge. So now we're ready to take our fabric over to the machine. If you take a look at your machine, your needle plate will most likely have these markings on it, and these denote seam allowance amounts. So if you line up your fabric with these lines, this will ensure you're getting the right seam allowance. So if you're using 3/8, line it up with 3/8 and so forth. You do have to make sure the needle is in the center neutral position for this though. Since I'm just sewing a cotton that's medium weight, I'm using a 2.5 stitch length, and we're not going to worry about the width as this is just a straight stitch. 2.5 is a great length for most projects, but if you are sewing something lighter weight, you want to decrease your stitch length. And if you're sewing something heavyweight like denim, you'll want to increase your stitch length. So we're going to take our fabric, which is right sides together, and we have 2 layers, and we're placing it underneath the presser foot and lowering the presser foot with this little lever here. We'll start with sewing a couple stitches forward and then using the reverse button and stitching a couple stitches backwards, and this is going to lock your stitching in place. This is called a back stitch, and you want to do it at the beginning and end of every seam. It's going to take some practice to get used to how your sewing machine sews, how fast the needle goes, depending on how hard you press on the pedal, and it'll feel a little weird at first, kind of like driving a new car. So just practice a bunch of straight lines until it starts to feel a bit more comfortable, and then we'll be able to move on to trying out some zigzag stitches. A little trick to being able to sew straight seams is don't look directly at your needle. Look at the guides on your needle plate and how your fabric is lining up with them, and that is going to ensure that you have the straightest line. If you just look at the needle, it's going to be really hard to sew straight lines. So remember to just keep your eyes on that seam allowance guide. So now that you're comfortable with straight stitches, we're going to move on to the zigzag. So we'll start by selecting the zigzag stitch. Mine is number 5 on my machine. You might have a dial to change for yours. The width is going to be how wide your zigzag is. So here you can see this one's a very wide stitch and this one's a very narrow one. And stitch length is going to be how long each little stitch is. You can see here I have very short stitches in the first seam and very long ones in the second. Zigzag stitches are mostly used for sewing knits as they will give your garment some stretch, or they can be used to finish the raw edges of your fabric if you don't have an overlocker or a serger. So let's talk about tension. Tension is how tight the stitches are, so how much thread passes through the machine with each stitch. Generally, most projects you will use a tension of about 4, but it does depend on the fabric. The lighter the fabric, the lower the tension, the heavier the fabric, the higher the tension. And I know a lot of people get tripped up with tension issues, and the way to troubleshoot those is by looking at your stitches. So here I have some examples. From the front, you can't really tell that there are any tension issues. The stitches look okay, and there aren't any obvious problems. But if you turn it to the back, you'll see here that top thread is being pulled underneath and looping, and it's obviously not the right tension. This one where it's looping, the tension was set at 0. So there wasn't enough tension on the top, and the bottom thread was pulling the top thread to the bottom. I sewed up some samples with different color thread in the top and bottom just to highlight tension issues, as it's hard to see with just one thread color. So here you can see the pink thread is the bobbin, and the lower tensions show that it's pulling the top thread, which is blue, to the underside a bit too much. You can see with the leftmost seam, it's a lot more balanced. I found that a 6 was the sweet spot for this fabric. It doesn't matter if you can see the color of the other thread, but you just want to make sure there's nicely formed stitches on both sides of the fabric. You want your stitches to look really balanced. You don't want to be able to see one thread pulling to the other side. Or another way that this shows up is one thread could look like it's just laying on the top and not creating actual stitches. I really like this graphic as it gives a really good visual of what your stitches should look like and how they should be meeting in the middle. But just make sure every time you start sewing that you sew a little test scrap and see what the tension is looking like. So once you've sewn some seams, then you can go on to practicing curves and zigzags. Some people say to practice on paper, but I think it's better to practice with scrap fabric and thread. You can buy cheap fabric at the thrift store and just practice sewing curved seams, pivoting, straight stitches, testing out your tension, all that good stuff with some cheap bed sheets or something like that. So that's it for episode 2 of my Learn to Sew series. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned some tips and tricks to get you started. I'm gonna have a new video on how to read sewing patterns coming up, as well as a Fabrics 101 video on how to choose the right fabric for your project. So make sure you subscribe if you wanna see those. And if you like this video, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.